This is a satirical award, but it's not completely satirical because we are all living in a media environment now that is beyond satire. I mean, we woke up this morning, everybody looks at the Drudge Report, and you discover that the moderator of the next vice presidential debate is, lo and behold, the president was a wedding guest of hers. So, I mean, we live in an environment where you can't satirize it anymore. But we'll try a little bit. Anyway, what are we doing here, or why is this night different from other nights? A couple of years ago, Roger Kimmel and I came up with the idea that the new Criterion and PJ Media should join forces to give this annual prize in honor or dishonor, as the case may be, of the somewhat notorious Moscow bureau chief of the New York Times between 1922 and 1936, Walter Duranty. I say somewhat notorious because hardly anybody really outside the insular media world knows who he was, but they should. Now in this room, to review, obviously in this room a lot of people know who he was, and I think not everybody, a couple of people told me, who's that? But for some 14 years, Walter Duranty, then the most famous and respected foreign correspondent in the world, also it happens a Brit, whitewashed the repressive evil deeds of the Soviet Union, leading to that country's recognition by none other than Franklin D. Roosevelt, while winning a 1932 Pulitzer Prize for his efforts. That Pulitzer is still, his photo is still hanging in the New York Times office for that, along with their other revered Pulitzers, although there's been some attempts to get it withdrawn, but it never happened. He did this whitewashing most prominently in the case of the Ukrainian Holodomor, the forced starvation of between 1.2 and 12 million ethnic Ukrainians, depending on whose estimates you believe. In other words, a lot of people. Duranty called that genocide, I quote, an exaggeration and malignant propaganda in the newspaper of record. He also covered up the show trial of the British engineers who were tortured into falsely confessing that they were trying to sabotage Stalin's 5-year plan, and similar events. All the time excusing those Soviet misdeeds with what became his personal watchword, "You have to break a few eggs to make an omelet." Meanwhile, he fiercely attacked those who dared criticize him, particularly, we'll see a lot of that in the people who are going to be honored tonight, particularly the brave Welsh journalist Gareth Jones, who risked his life to report on the Holodomor, and the British author Malcolm Muggeridge, who returned the compliment by calling Duranty, quote, "the greatest liar I have met in 50 years of journalism," unquote. Says a lot. Virtually the same year he was winning his Pulitzer, Duranty was reassuring Soviet authorities that he would allow them to vet all reports about their country before they appeared in the New York Times, effectively making that newspaper a U.S. branch of Pravda for his times. So why did Walter Duranty do all this? What motivated him to write this way, to lie so flagrantly, seemingly without conscience? It's an interesting question. That was the primary question that compelled Cheryl Langen and myself, my wife Cheryl, when we started to research for our stage play, which you have before you, The Party Line, in which Duranty is one of the main characters, not the whole thing, and of which you have a copy. Our assumption, like most people, when we started to research it, was that Duranty was driven by ideology. The line about the eggs and the omelet sounds suspiciously like a folksy version of "the ends justify the means." I mean, it sounds like it. But it turned out not to be true. Duranty wasn't much of a leftist at all. In fact, on several occasions, he dismissed communism as a system suitable only for the East, for primitive Russians who craved and needed a strong leader like Comrade Joe, and as such wouldn't work in the West. No, Duranty's motives were far more personal and modern, even postmodern. Dr. Johnson famously told us that no man but a blockhead ever wrote except for money, making a lot of bloggers blockheads, but never mind. But for Duranty, it was money, but it was more than that. No, he wasn't a communist, or communists certainly used him. He was instead a bohemian of his time, a friend and follower of the Satanist Aleister Crowley, steeped in sex, drugs, and rock and roll before there was rock and roll, who was snatched from the absinthe bars of trendy spots of Paris to be the Moscow correspondent of the New York Times. a modern narcissist par excellence. Duranty did what he did for power and acclaim, to be the man in Moscow, the most listened to correspondent on the most important story of his day, to be feted at the Waldorf Astoria, which he was, to be hugely famous, or to borrow the title of Leo Brody's book, for the frenzy of renown, Vanity Fair, if you will. In that way, he is like our award winners tonight, although perhaps he went a bit further. Like Duranty, none of them are communists, at least as far as I know, but they certainly lust after Vanity Fair to one degree or another. They have allowed their desire to be chic, to be outrageous or modern and trendy, to be popular kids with a political in-crowd, to overshadow everything they do, and to warp their writing beyond the normal bias into outright distortion and propaganda. They should be a lesson to all of us and a warning to the public. A recent Pew poll showed, I think as probably many of you read, public dissatisfaction with the mass media has reached what Pew called a fresh high, unquote, with 60% of Americans saying they have little or no trust in the mass media to report the news fully, accurately, and fairly. Personally, I wonder who the 40% are, but anyway, again, never mind. We hope the Duranty Prize, acting as a warning, will do its little bit to correct this. Before I relinquish the podium, a word about our methods. Some months ago, PJ Media and the new Criterion publicized the prize and solicited nominations from our readerships, which then were vetted by a committee of professional writers and journalists, some of whom are with us tonight. Peter Collier, who's supposed to be on the way from Tuscany, I don't see him here yet, didn't make it. Cliff May, who's here and once wrote for the notorious New York Times. Ron Radosh, who'll be talking to you shortly. Glenn Reynolds, who's back in Los Angeles. Claudia Rosette, who's here with us tonight, and the two Rogers, Kimball and myself. We received over 150 different nominations, but ended up hewing remarkably close to the recommendations of our readership. We abjured only one of the top 4 nominations that came in, NBC for its selective editing of the Trayvon Martin case, because we couldn't determine the culpability at that point. Now it's in front of the courts, so we'll learn the truth, maybe.